It wasn't thunder.
Stand down!
That's what Sheriff Jake Reddick
What is
kept
it, boy?
whispering to himself every time the wind slammed against the cracked windows of the Hickory County outpost. The storm had rolled in fast and sharp, the kind that scraped the sky open and made you feel like something ancient was moving through it. But this noise, it wasn't from the clouds. It came low, guttural, from the earth, like a cry that had nowhere left to go but up. Bruno heard it first. The retired K9 had been sleeping on the porch since dusk, paws crossed, ears relaxed, tail still. But the second the first shudder rolled through the ground, he stood up, not startled, not afraid, just alert. He tilted his head toward the northeast, where the old Whitmore property sat under the weight of silence. Jake watched him through the screen door. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared, steady and unmoving, into the dark. And then he stepped off the porch, into the rain. Not fast, not panicked, deliberate. Jake had seen Bruno take down armed fugitives, sniff out a meth lab buried in a cornfield, sit with a dying child after a fire gutted half the town. But he'd never seen him move like this, like he already knew something was waiting, like he was being called. 15 minutes later, Jake found the envelope. No name, no stamp. Just a wrinkled white fold left under the office door, edges damp from the storm. He opened it using the edge of his old badge. Number 17, the one he kept from when he first joined the department, back when the town still believed nothing evil could happen here. Inside, a single sentence. The children still cry beneath her floor. Jake's breath caught. Not because of what it said, but because of who it hinted at. Clara Whitmore. For 20 years, she'd run what people called a mercy house, a rural safe haven for at-risk kids. The town gave her awards. Church ladies baked pies for her fundraisers. She dressed as Mrs. Claus every December, handed out handmade scarves downtown, and hosted harvest dinners that made the front page of the Cotton Ridge Gazette. Jake had always thought something about her was too polished. The way her boots were always muddy, but her porch was spotless. The way no one ever saw the kids in town, not even at the market. But he'd never had cause to dig deeper. Until tonight. By the time he pulled the cruiser out of the gravel lot, Bruno was already sitting in the passenger seat, soaked but calm, like he'd been waiting for the order. "You know where we're going," Jake muttered, glancing sideways. Bruno didn't look at him. He was staring through the windshield, right at the barn. The Whitmore property hadn't changed since the last time Jake had driven past. White pillars, flickering porch light, wind chimes tapping against each other like nervous fingers. Clara met them at the gate, umbrella in one hand, her other holding a flashlight that didn't quite hide the tension in her grip. "Evening, Sheriff," she said, smiling with too many teeth. "Little late for a social visit. Storm's getting rough." Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Thought we'd check in on the kids." Bruno didn't wait for small talk. He was already pulling toward the barn. Clara's smile tightened. "Oh, that old thing? Just tools and junk. Not exactly child-friendly." "I'll be the judge of that." Jake's boots hit mud as he stepped past her. Bruno reached the barn first, planted himself at the threshold, and let out a sound Jake hadn't heard in years, a deep, vibrating growl that didn't warn, didn't threaten. It mourned. Jake's flashlight swept over the room. Cobwebs, dust, a tractor under a tarp. Nothing unusual, but Bruno wasn't moving. He started pawing at the ground near a pile of hay, sniffing, tail stiff. Clara's voice sharpened behind them. "Sheriff, I must insist, this is my private—" Jake cut her off. "You got a basement under this barn?" "No," she said too fast. "The foundation's solid earth." Bruno pawed harder. His nails scraped something, wood beneath the dirt. Jake dropped to one knee, cleared the hay back. There it was, a floorboard, slightly warped, slightly newer, no hinges, no handle, but something was wrong. too symmetrical, too clean. He knocked, hollow. He looked up. Clara had gone pale. Jake stood. "I'll be coming back with a warrant. You'll be wasting your time." He locked eyes with her. "We'll see." That night, back at the station, Jake couldn't sleep. Bruno paced the room like a soldier stuck on guard duty with no enemy in sight. At 2:17 a.m., the dog stopped, ears perked, eyes on the door. Then Jake heard it. Not wind, not thunder. A sound low and wet, like a sob pressed through dirt. A sound no one should ever hear coming from under a barn floor. The phone rang. Jake answered without looking. It was Deputy Rhodes, voice tight. "Sheriff, someone left a message on my windshield tonight. Said the train comes Thursday. That's when they take them." Jake looked at Bruno. The dog's eyes were already turned towards the east, toward the barn, toward what waited underneath. The second time they arrived at the Whitmore property, the clouds hadn't cleared, but the mood had. Everything looked too perfect. Children sat in rows inside the dining hall, hands folded, napkins in laps. A blonde girl no older than 10 offered Jake a shy wave as he passed. There were biscuits on every plate, warm and fluffy. Apple butter glistened in little mason jars. The smell of cinnamon hung in the air like a spell. Clara Whitmore walked ahead of them, smiling that same polite smile that always stopped just short of her eyes. "We're all very grateful for your concern, Sheriff," she said sweetly. "But as you can see, our children are well fed, well loved, and very safe." Jake nodded, glancing at each child. Nothing visibly wrong. But too many smiles, looked rehearsed. Bruno ignored them all. The old German shepherd moved through the room like he wasn't interested in anything on this side of the wall. He didn't sniff the food, didn't greet the kids. He headed straight toward the back of the house, through a side hallway that led toward the barn. His gait was slow, focused, like he was listening with more than ears. Jake followed him, boots creaking on the hardwood. "That's off limits, I'm afraid," Clara called behind them, heels tapping faster. "The barn is nothing but rusty tools and broken shelves, not safe for dogs or deputies." But Bruno was already at the barn door, nose to the crack in the wood. He let out a low, steady growl. Not a threat, a warning. Jake stepped beside him, pressed a hand to the door. "Mind if I take a quick look, Clara?" She hesitated. "Of course," she said tightly. "After all, we wouldn't want any misunderstanding." Inside, the barn smelled like dust and something older, like mildew had sunk into the bones of the wood and made a home. The air was still, like it didn't want to move in front of them. Bruno walked the perimeter first, slow, methodical. He passed the old hay bales, a toppled wheelbarrow, and a stack of rotted fence posts. Then he stopped. Jake watched as Bruno lowered his nose to the floor and began circling a spot near the far wall. Same place as before. His tail was stiff, ears forward. He crouched low, placed both front paws on the spot, and scraped once, twice. On the third scrape, Jake heard it. Thud. Hollow. A muffled echo beneath the plank floor. He knelt, knocking his knuckles along the board. The sound shifted midway through, a distinct wooden ring against emptiness. "Clara," he said without looking up, "you told me the barn was built straight on dirt." She didn't answer at first. When she did, her voice was all sugar again. "I did say that. Perhaps I was mistaken. The structure is older than I am." Jake stood. "Mind if I check what's underneath?" "It's probably just air pockets. The foundation here isn't what it used to be." Bruno growled again. Shorter this time. More urgent. Jake reached for the crowbar he'd tucked into the back of his belt before leaving the station, an old habit from his early days in the field. He wedged it under the floorboard Bruno had marked. It didn't budge. He tried again, this time pressing his boot into it for leverage. Still nothing. Behind him, Clara's smile had vanished. Jake turned. "You sure there's nothing you forgot to mention?" Clara folded her arms. "Sheriff, with all due respect, I think this little visit has gone far enough." Jake didn't move. Bruno did. The dog barked once, a sharp, deliberate crack that bounced off the walls like a gavel. It was the first bark he'd given in weeks, and it shook Jake to the core. Clara stepped forward, posture stiff. "I'd like you to leave now." Jake nodded slowly. "You're right, but I'll be back." With paperwork, he turned toward Bruno. "Let's go." The shepherd hesitated. He looked at the plank again, sniffed once more, and finally backed away, glancing over his shoulder like he didn't trust the air in the room to stay still after they left it. Back outside, the wind had picked up again. Thunder growled far off, echoing behind the hills. "Don't like it," Jake muttered as he opened the cruiser door. Bruno jumped into the passenger seat, still tense. His ears twitched toward the barn even as Jake drove them away. They rode in silence until the property faded from the rearview mirror. Jake broke it first. "She's hiding something." Bruno didn't respond, but Jake swore he caught the faintest nod in the way the dog tilted his head, like he agreed without needing words. That night, Jake sat in the dark of his office, the letter still on his desk, the handwriting jagged and too familiar. The children still cry beneath her floor. Bruno paced the room like he couldn't shake something off. He'd pause every few minutes, stare at the window, then keep moving. Like he was tracking ghosts only he could smell. At 10:05 p.m., a train whistle echoed in the distance. Bruno froze. Then he walked to the door and sat down, facing it. Jake stood behind him. They both knew. Whatever Clara Whitmore had buried, it wasn't dead. And it wasn't done. Jake Reddick had been a sheriff long enough to know when someone was dancing around the truth. Clara Whitmore didn't dance. She glided. Polite, charming, warm when she needed to be. But her smile always came with a subtle pause, as if she were pulling it from a drawer she only opened in emergencies. Back at the station, Jake poured lukewarm coffee into a chipped mug and leaned against the window. The rain had quieted, but left behind a low fog that clung to the trees like secrets not yet told. Bruno lay by the door, not asleep, just watching, waiting. The knock came just past 9 p.m. Reverend Josiah Kramer, wool coat damp and glasses fogged, stepped inside. He rubbed his hands together, nodded toward Bruno, and gave Jake a tired smile. "Just checking in," the Reverend said. "Clara called me. Said you came by this afternoon asking strange questions." Jake sipped his coffee. Didn't realize asking about a hollow floorboard counted as strange. Kramer chuckled, but it sounded rehearsed. "She's got every permit, every certificate. That woman has done more for the children in this town than anyone else I know. Christmas, Easter, food drives, medical bills." Jake held up a hand. "I know what she's done, Reverend. I'm asking about what she might be doing now." Kramer looked uncomfortable. He glanced down at Bruno, who had not stopped watching him since he entered. "Jake," the Reverend said carefully, "people around here, they believe in Clara. She's like a saint to them. You go digging without proof, you'll start something that doesn't end. Easy." Jake looked at the fogged window again. "Maybe it's already started." The Reverend sighed and left not long after, leaving a pamphlet from last year's Whitmore Foundation Gala on Jake's desk. A photo of Clara smiling, arms around 3 children, faces blurred by legal protocol. She looked proud, but now Jake wasn't so sure she deserved it. At 11:42 p.m., Jake was still at his desk when Bruno stood up. Not stretched, not shifted. Stood. The dog moved toward the door, ears tilted toward the east like a compass tuning itself. Jake followed his gaze. A faint sound in the distance. Not the wind. Not thunder. A train whistle. Bruno let out a low whine, the kind he used when something was wrong and too far away to reach. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and howled. It wasn't a bark, not a warning. It was a cry, low, long, filled with something ancient and wounded. It crawled up the walls of the station and settled deep in Jake's ribs. The sound of something that had heard pain and remembered it. Jake's hand tightened around the mug. No one else in town would have noticed. Trains passed every Thursday night, always had. But now it felt timed, measured. The letter still sat on his desk drawer. The children still cry beneath her floor. He opened the drawer and looked at it again. The paper had yellowed slightly. The handwriting hadn't changed. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. The next morning, Jake stopped in at Dee's diner for his usual black coffee and oatmeal. People waved like they always did. Small-town rhythm. Nothing new. But as he waited at the counter, he heard them. Voices, whispering. She's got those kids so well behaved. Mine won't even put a dish in the sink. Heard she turned down another award. Said she didn't do it for praise. My cousin says she fed half the county last Thanksgiving. Jake stirred his oatmeal slowly. In a place like Cotton Ridge, reputation was gospel. If Clara Whitmore was a saint, then questioning her was heresy. He turned to leave and almost bumped into a young boy. Thin, quiet. Maybe 8 or 9. The boy didn't say anything, just looked up at Jake with wide eyes, then looked down at Bruno. Bruno didn't bark. He only stepped forward, gently sniffed the boy's hand. The boy's fingers flinched. Then he pulled back and vanished into the crowd. Jake stood there for a moment, watching the empty space where the boy had been. That night, the fog returned. Bruno paced again. Slower now, more deliberate. He circled the same spot near the front door 3 times before lying down, head resting on his front paws, eyes open. At 10:05 p.m., the train whistle blew again. Bruno didn't howl this time. He stood, walked to the back door, and sat facing it. Jake joined him, arms crossed, shoulder against the frame. You know, he said softly, I've had this job long enough to know when something's wrong. What I don't know is if I'm the only one left willing to say it out, loud. Bruno's tail thumped once. Outside, the wind shifted, pushing fog through the trees like breath through clenched teeth. No one else in town had heard the whistle, or if they had, they ignored it. No one else had seen the hollow floor or the way Clara's smile slipped. No one else had watched the dog pause in a silent barn and place his paw on the ground like marking a grave. But Jake had. And Bruno? Bruno had never been wrong. Not once. Not in 10 years of fires, floods, missing kids, and things found buried under worse than dirt. Jake went to bed with his boots still on, his badge on the nightstand, and the window cracked open. He wanted to be ready, because whatever Bruno had heard, it was still crying. The morning after Bruno's second midnight vigil, the fog finally lifted. But not from Jake's mind. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again. The whistle slicing through the quiet, Bruno's head lifting, ears locked forward, still as stone. He told himself it was coincidence. He'd been a lawman long enough to know you don't build cases on hunches. But Bruno wasn't a hunch. Bruno was fact. Jake stepped out of the station, rubbing the bridge of his nose, and scanned the town square. Cotton Ridge was already waking up. Early risers rolling feed carts, mailboxes creaking open. Normal. On the surface. He climbed into the cruiser. Bruno jumped in without needing to be called. The morning patrol was slow. Nothing unusual. Nothing obvious. Jake circled past Whitmore House anyway. From the road, the place looked like a postcard. American flags in the garden beds, rocking chairs lined up just right, a faint scent of fresh bread in the air. But Bruno pressed his nose to the window and let out the faintest grunt. Jake parked anyway. Just a walk by. No warrant, no questions, just presence. As they made their way down the gravel path, the children were outside for their exercise hour. A dozen of them, no more than 10 years old, playing with hoops and chalk under the watchful eye of a staff member in a yellow windbreaker. A girl stood apart. She was small, sharp-boned, with dark hair and eyes too old for her age. She wasn't drawing, she wasn't smiling, she wasn't moving. Jake met her gaze. She didn't blink. As he passed her, she took one step forward. Barely more than a shift in the dirt. Then, with a glance at the staff member, she slid her hand into the side pocket of Jake's jacket, barely brushing him. She didn't say a word. Jake kept walking. Bruno paused. He looked at the girl, then at Jake. Back in the cruiser, Jake didn't move. He sat still behind the wheel, heart crawling up into his throat. Then he reached into his pocket. A note. Folded twice. Torn from a child's workbook. Crumpled from fear. He opened it. They come when the train whistle blows. Please listen to him. He knows. He read it again. Then again. Bruno sat tall, watching him. His eyes didn't move. Jake held the note tighter. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was confirmation. The next freight train passed every Thursday night at 10:05 p.m. It had for years. A routine nobody questioned. Until now. Jake turned the engine over. He didn't drive away from the property. He circled around the block. Once. Twice. On the third pass, he stopped behind the feed store and pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 1. Go ahead, Unit 1. You still got that old train schedule bulletin hanging by the backboard? Yeah, Sheriff. Right above the calendar with the bad cat photos. Jake almost smiled. Almost. Snap a picture and send it to my line, would you? A pause. You think something's coming in? I think it's already been. 10 minutes later, he sat in the back booth at Dee's Diner with a steaming cup of black coffee and the photo pulled up on his phone. He marked every Thursday train in red. Then cross-checked every missing child report in the Tri-County area for the past 3 years. 7 disappearances, all within a 24-hour window of a Thursday freight. His pulse quickened. Bruno nudged his leg under the table. Jake looked down. The dog was staring not at him, but at the window, at something beyond it. A child, watching them. Same sharp-boned frame. Same still eyes. Lila Grace. She stood across the street, clutching a tattered backpack, waiting like she'd been told to stand there, like she only had this one moment to be seen. Jake stood fast, but when he opened the door, she was gone. Only the swing of the gate behind the general store remained. That afternoon, Jake took the note to the deputy. You think this was a prank? Rhodes asked, turning the paper in his fingers. No kid writes that for fun. Jake said. And she didn't say it. She didn't dare. That says more than anything. Rhodes frowned. You're chasing ghosts, Jake. Jake looked down at Bruno. Number I'm following, the only thing in this town that still knows how to find the truth. That night, 10:05 p.m., the train whistle blew again. Jake didn't flinch this time. Bruno didn't howl. He stood, walked to the door. Saturday waiting. Jake joined him, flashlight in one hand, keys in the other. Let's see where the tracks go, he said. And this time, Bruno wagged his tail. Once. Not because he was happy, but because someone had finally started listening. The paper shook slightly in Jake Reddick's hand. Not from nerves, his hands didn't shake anymore, but from the wind pressing hard against the windshield of the cruiser. Rain hadn't come yet, but it was in the air, thick, watching. Beside him, Bruno sat motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon like he'd already arrived. Jake glanced again at the folded inspection order signed by the county judge. No more soft visits, no more polite questions. This time, it was official. The cruiser rolled up the Whitmore driveway, slow and deliberate. The porch, light was on. Curtains drawn. Everything in its place, right down to the clay rooster by the front steps. But Jake didn't head for the house. He headed for the barn. Clara opened the door before he even knocked. "Sheriff?" she said with a strained smile. "You're back." "I am. And the purpose of your visit." Jake handed her the folded paper. She took it with fingers too still. "We've received multiple reports. I'm here to inspect every building on the property, top to bottom." "I see." Her voice lost its sugar. "Well then, let's get it over with." She turned and walked ahead without another word. Jake didn't follow her path. Bruno was already halfway across the field, heading for the barn like it was calling his name. Jake followed. Inside, the barn smelled different than before. Cleaner. Too clean. Jake scanned the room. Hay bales had been rearranged, tools polished. Even the dust on the rafters seemed freshly disturbed. Bruno ignored all of it. He moved straight to the far wall, nose to the ground, tail low, body stiff. He reached the patch of floor he'd marked days ago, paused, then began to dig. His front paws moved with purpose, clawing through the layer of straw and dirt with steady rhythm. Jake knelt beside him, brushing aside what Bruno had loosened. Then he saw it. A rusted iron ring, almost swallowed by the grain of the wood. A trapdoor disguised beneath years of paint and dirt. Jake didn't hesitate. He pulled out the crowbar and wedged it under the edge. The board groaned like it hadn't been touched in decades. But it moved. The door lifted with a dry crack. A rush of cold air spilled upward, wet, sour, wrong. Bruno growled low in his throat. Not anger, not fear, something deeper, something that said he already knew what waited below. Jake turned to Clara. She hadn't followed him into the barn. He looked back down. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. The flashlight on his belt clicked on. The beam landed on stone steps slick with condensation. The walls were dirt and brick, uneven, like the bones of the place had shifted. "Stay here," he told Bruno. The dog didn't move. Jake descended. The steps creaked under his weight. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew. It smelled like mildew, metal, and something else. Something alive once. At the bottom was a cramped room, maybe 10 feet across. The walls were lined with shelves, most empty. A rusted chain hung from a hook in the ceiling. In the center of the floor sat a heavy chair, bolted to the concrete. Jake stepped forward. The chair wasn't just old, it was stained. He didn't want to guess with what. Beside it, a bucket. Empty. Cleaned too recently. He crouched beside the chair, running a gloved hand across the metal armrest. Notched into it were markings, lines, carved over time. Some deep, some faded. Not initials. Not words. Just counting. Jake swallowed hard. Then something clicked behind him. He spun. The stairs were still empty. But the trapdoor at the top had moved. Light above flickered. Bruno barked once, a sharp alarm. Jake raced up the steps, 2 at a time. By the time he reached the barn floor, Clara Whitmore was gone. The front gate stood open. Mud tracked toward the road. A faint echo of a car engine faded into the wind. He looked around, eyes scanning the yard, the house, the tree line. Nothing. Bruno was already at the driveway, barking twice before turning back to Jake. She ran. Jake muttered, voice low. Bruno paced in tight circles, then stopped, ears locked forward, growling again, more insistent. Jake grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. Suspect Clara Whitmore has fled the scene. Active warrant now in play. Alert state troopers and notify FBI liaison." He paused. "And send backup to the Whitmore barn. I found a room, one not listed on any property record." He clicked off. Bruno was already staring at the trapdoor, waiting. Jake crouched beside him. She knew we were close. The wind pushed harder now. Thunder finally cracked. Jake looked down into the blackness of the open hatch, then back toward the road Clara had taken. It wasn't just about what she was hiding anymore. It was about who and how many. The storm had finally arrived. Sheets of rain slammed the barn roof like fists of regret, and thunder rolled over Cotton Ridge in low, guttural waves. Floodlights set up by the responding units cast harsh beams over the soaked pasture, turning mud into silver and shadows into ghosts. But Jake Reddick didn't notice the weather. He was too deep beneath the barn, following a trail only Bruno could have found. They had returned with a full search team just after sunrise. The rusted trap door was pried open again, this time surrounded by men with gloves, masks, and flashlights. Agent Rivera from the FBI stood at the threshold, her boots just above the first step, eyes scanning every inch of the hidden room. Bruno paced in circles at the bottom, not aimless, intent, focused. He paused, nose low, in the corner behind the old crates. Jake stepped closer, heart tightening. "What you got, boy?" he asked. Bruno let out a low growl, then pressed his nose to the dirt wall. Agent Rivera moved beside him. "That's solid," she said. "No door. No marks." Jake tapped the wall. It sounded packed, but wrong. Bruno scraped at the ground with one paw. Then again. Jake dropped to one knee, digging with gloved hands. A few inches in, his fingers hit wood. Something flat, splintered. "A hatch," he muttered. "Buried on purpose." They brought in tools. Crowbars, picks. Within minutes, a square panel about 3 feet wide had been uncovered. Iron nails sealed it shut. Jake and Rivera pried them loose one by one. Then they lifted it. A rush of cold air escaped, so cold it didn't belong to the world above. Bruno backed up but didn't leave. He stood his ground, tail low, body tense. A narrow tunnel stretched out below, just tall enough to crawl. Dirt walls, wooden supports barely holding. Jake turned to Rivera. "I'm going in." "I'll go with you." "No," he said. "We need someone here if it collapses. I'll take Bruno." Rivera hesitated, then nodded. "Take this." She handed him a headset. "You lose contact. I come after you in 5. Jake clipped it on. "Let's go, buddy." Bruno crawled first, nose leading, tail brushing the floor. The tunnel went on forever. The further they moved, the colder the air grew. Jake's flashlight bounced shadows off uneven walls, each one a flicker of something unseen. Moisture dripped from the ceiling. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, stifled. Then they heard it, a sound too soft to be real at first, like cloth tearing, then clearer, a whimper. Bruno froze. Jake leaned in, holding his breath. Another sound, a cough, ragged, young. They pushed forward. The tunnel widened into a chamber, barely lit. A single dim bulb flickered overhead, wired crudely to an old car battery. And there they were, children. So many of them. Tiny bodies hunched together, some chained to the walls, others to each other. Blankets torn to ribbons, eyes wide but empty, skin pale from lack of sun. The air smelled of urine, rust, fear. Bruno didn't bark. He didn't move. He stood in the middle of them and laid down. One child, no older than 6, crawled toward him, trembling. She placed a hand on his fur and whispered something Jake couldn't hear. Then another child reached out, and another. Within moments, Bruno was surrounded. Jake's voice cracked. "It's okay. You're safe now." He tapped his headset. "Rivera, we found them. Jesus, we found them. Status?" Her voice snapped back. "Alive. 30. maybe more. Bring medical and chainsaw teams. They're shackled. Copy that. Help's on the way. Jake moved quickly, checking each child. Some barely conscious, others alert but silent. One boy had a broken arm set in cloth. Another girl had bruises older than memory. He counted 31. 31 children who had vanished without a trace. Children whose names lived on milk cartons and flyers. Children whose faces had been replaced by newer tragedies. Bruno lay still, allowing small hands to grip his ears, stroke his neck, whisper things no adult could understand. He wasn't just calming them, he was grounding them. Jake turned as the rescue team crawled in, medical bags in hand, blankets ready. The children didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just watched, eyes wide, waiting for someone to finally believe they were real. Back above ground, chaos turned into order. Paramedics moved fast. News hadn't broken yet, but word had already started leaking. Deputies set up a perimeter. Rivera took Clara's file straight to the Federal Manhunt Board. She was now wanted in 4 states. The farm was sealed, and Jake stood by the barn door, soaked to the skin, mud up, to his knees. Bruno sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. But both of them heard it, the faintest sound rising from the earth behind them. Not a cry, a breath, a reminder that even now, not everything had been uncovered. The sun hadn't risen yet when Jake Reddick stepped into the records room at the county courthouse. Files littered the long table, coffee stains bled through manila folders, and the overhead light flickered like it resented being awake this early. Jake flipped through the last of the Whitmore files. Names, adoption forms, signatures, and the same medical examiner on nearly all of them. Dr. Emery Lane. It wasn't just the repetition, it was the way the dates didn't line up. Paperwork filed the day after a child supposedly arrived. Immunization forms signed for children who were never seen at school. And when Jake checked the Department of Child Welfare system, he found notes, neatly typed but vague, confirming health evaluations conducted by Lynn himself. Jake circled the name, then underlined it. Bruno stood by the door, tail still, body waiting. By mid-morning, they were driving north toward Willow's End, a quiet, well-off neighborhood where front porches were always swept and dogs never barked. Dr. Lynn's office was attached to his house. Colonial, blue shutters, stone steps. Too perfect. Jake rang the bell. A young nurse answered, her badge reading Chelsea. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing at Bruno with hesitance. "Sheriff Reddick," Jake said, showing his badge. "I'm here to speak with Doctor." Lynn, her smile faltered. "He's not in yet." Jake looked at the driveway. A car was parked. Warm engine. He tilted his head. "Mind if I wait?" Before she could answer, Bruno's ears twitched. Then he moved. Fast. He passed the nurse and darted down the hallway, ignoring her shouts. Jake followed without hesitation. "Sir, you can't—" But Bruno was already at the basement door, growling low. Jake pushed past Chelsea and pulled the handle. Locked. He stepped back and kicked the door in. The frame cracked open. Stairs led downward into a dim corridor lit with cold blue fluorescence. The smell hit him first, sterile and rotten, a clash of bleach and something metallic underneath. "Stay here," Jake snapped at the nurse. He didn't check if she listened. Bruno was halfway down the steps, pausing only when the floor turned from wood to tile. The hallway at the bottom branched into 2 directions. Jake scanned the walls, lined with photos, degrees from Ivy League schools, a few smiling children holding certificates. Bruno turned right. The door at the end was steel. Jake's shoulder hit it hard. Once. Twice. The latch snapped. Inside was what looked like a lab, if the lab had been buried, hidden, and scrubbed over 100 times to erase its sins. Drawers labeled with codes, a refrigeration unit humming. Files stacked on a metal desk, tagged with initials. Jake moved toward the desk and opened the first folder. Subject, JM, age 9, low tolerance, withdrew after second injection, removed. He turned to the page. Subject, LG, age 8, compliant, resilient, exceptional auditory tracking, flagged for extended observation. LG Lila Grace. Jake's chest tightened. Bruno sniffed along the edge of the room, stopping at a closed cabinet. He growled once, sharp. Jake opened it. Inside, vials, dozens, labeled by date, initials, and dosage. Most had names. Some had notes like transferred, failed, or simply gone. Jake stepped back, bile rising in his throat. Behind him, Bruno turned toward a small vent near the back wall and barked, short, urgent. Jake dropped to one knee. From inside the vent, faint and barely audible, came the sound of something shifting. Then a voice, small, hoarse. Help! Jake yanked open the cover. Inside, curled in a space no larger than a crawl hole, was a child. Eyes wide, body trembling. Lila. Hey, hey, Jake whispered, reaching in gently. It's okay. I'm here. Bruno crouched low, licking her fingers when she reached out. Jake pulled her out slowly. She was light. Too light. He wrapped her in his jacket, heart thundering. You're safe now, he said. Behind them, footsteps echoed down the hall. Jake turned, gun drawn. Dr. Emery Lynn stood at the top of the stairs, hands raised, pale, sweating. I never hurt them, he stammered. It was data. Clara said they'd be protected. Jake didn't blink. You trafficked children. You let them suffer for numbers. I thought they were wards. She showed me the licenses. I didn't know. You knew enough to hide a child in your walls. Jake nodded at Bruno. The dog growled once. Lynn sank to the floor, sobbing. Outside, backup arrived. Rivera met Jake at the cruiser, eyes wide as she saw the child in his arms. Lila? She whispered. Jake nodded. Alive. Barely, but alive. Bruno sat at Lila's feet. She looked down and whispered something to him Jake couldn't hear, but Bruno heard it, and his tail moved once, slow, certain. He had found her, and he wasn't done yet. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low over Cotton Ridge like it hadn't decided whether to break or hold. Jake stood at the back of Dr. Emery Lynn's clinic, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on his belt. He scanned the tree line, the perimeter, then down to the uneven wooden deck that curved behind the building like an afterthought. Bruno paced in tight, deliberate circles near the rear wall. There was something under the boards. The dog had gone still, nose pressed against the ground, front paw pawing at a narrow seam where the wood grain broke pattern. Jake dropped to one knee, knocked. Hollow, he pried up the boards one by one. Beneath them, packed dirt and something else, a trapdoor, smaller than the one in Whitmore's barn, but newer, built in a hurry. The latch was smeared with dirt and something darker. He clicked on his flashlight and looked at Bruno. You sure? Bruno didn't move. He just stared at the door like it had been waiting for him. Jake opened it. A rush of musty air hit him. Wet rot, iron, and something else he couldn't name, but had smelled before. Pain leaves its own kind of scent. There were stairs. Narrow. Slick. Too steep for accident. Jake climbed down slowly, Bruno at his heels. The space below was no wider than a shed. Walls of unfinished plywood. Concrete floor. In the far corner a figure slumped. Small. Still. Jake moved fast. He knelt beside her, heart pounding. Lila, he whispered. The girl stirred, then blinked once. Her skin was pale, lips dry. Duct tape hung loose around one wrist, the rest of the binding sliced, not torn. She wasn't struggling anymore, but she was alive. Jake removed his jacket and wrapped her gently. She looked up at him, then past him, to Bruno. You came back, she said softly, then slower. I heard your footsteps coming down the stairs. I knew it was you. Bruno stepped closer. She reached a thin hand and touched his muzzle. Then she leaned into him, cheek pressed to his neck. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Jake hit the radio. "This is Reddick. We've got Lila Grace, alive. I repeat, alive. Immediate evac needed. Secondary chamber under Lynn's office." "Copy that," came Rivera's voice. "EMS is en route. Hold tight." Jake held her closer. Bruno laid beside them, silent and unmoving, like a sentinel who knew his job wasn't just to find the broken, but to stay until someone else could carry them. 30 miles away, in a quiet Kansas town, Clara Whitmore smiled sweetly as she handed out hymn books in the back pew of a small church. Her name was Evelyn Trask now. Her story, a widow who'd lost everything and found faith again. She wore pearls, carried lemon bars wrapped in wax paper. She even led Bible study on Tuesdays. She would have kept going too, except for the woman who walked in wearing a grey FBI windbreaker, said her real name without pause, and handcuffed her in front of 15 stunned parishioners. Clara didn't fight, didn't scream. She just looked toward the stained glass window and muttered, "Too curious, Thomas. Always too curious." By nightfall, she was in federal custody. Jake didn't attend the arrest. He didn't need to. He was at the hospital, sitting beside Lila Grace's bed while doctors moved around them like ghosts. Bruno curled beneath her cot. She was asleep now, her breathing even. Jake watched the rise and fall of her chest and thought about the other kids, 31 of them, who never thought someone was coming. He thought about how none of them cried when they were found, how they were too used to silence to know it was safe to speak. And he thought about Bruno. The dog hadn't barked once inside that underground room. He hadn't needed to. His presence was enough. His steps, louder than a siren. He was more than trained instinct. He was memory, proof, hope. And not everyone had the courage to follow him through a door like that. But Jake had. And now, so would the world. The federal courthouse in Memphis stood like a stone sentinel against the summer heat. News vans clustered outside, protesters with signs, reporters with microphones. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet for what the world was about to hear. Sheriff Jake Reddick sat 3 rows back in the packed courtroom, hands folded over his knee. He wore his best uniform, but not for show. It felt like armor. Bruno wasn't at his feet. The judge had ruled no animals inside the chambers, even service dogs. So Bruno waited outside the glass doors, seated just beyond the security line, like he knew the weight of the day better than most humans did. On the other side of the room, Clara Whitmore sat at the defense table. Still, unblinking. Her pearls perfectly scented, her cardigan a soft lavender. She looked like someone's grandmother, not the architect of a system that chained children underground. Her lawyers whispered to her now and then. She never responded. The judge entered. Court came to order. Then the testimony began. One by one, the children stepped forward. Not all 31, not all could speak yet. But those who could, did. A girl named Cameron, a boy called Eli, faces once pale, now carrying the weight of being heard. They described the tunnels, the dark, the smell, the chains. They described the silence. But it was Lila Grace who made the courtroom freeze. She walked in wearing a navy blue dress, her hair neatly pulled back. In her arms, she carried a small, stuffed dog with a red ribbon collar. She looked directly at the judge, not at Clara, and said softly, "I want to tell the truth." The prosecutor nodded. Lila took a deep breath, then said, "We stayed quiet because we thought no one would come." A pause. But the dog did. He came. He knew. The judge leaned forward. "The dog?" "Yes," Lila said. "Bruno, he found us. He sat with us. We heard his paws over the floor. He didn't leave. He didn't have to ask if we were okay. He just stayed. She looked toward the doors at the back of the courtroom. He knew where we were, but the adults didn't believe him. They never listened to him. If they had, maybe it wouldn't have taken so long. A murmur swept the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel once, gently. "That's all," Lila said, stepping down. She clutched her stuffed animal tight as she returned to her seat beside Agent Rivera. Outside, behind the glass, Bruno lifted his head. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Jake didn't leave the courthouse. Neither did Bruno. They waited under the shade of a concrete pillar. Lila sat with them for part of it, one hand resting on Bruno's shoulder like they shared a language only they could hear. Then the call came. Verdict. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. Clara stood when asked, her expression unreadable. On the counts of conspiracy, human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and obstruction of justice. The foreman said, voice steady. We find the defendant guilty. All counts. Jake didn't breathe for a moment. Clara's expression didn't break. But Bruno, watching through the glass panel outside, slowly lowered his head to the floor. He didn't bark, didn't shift, just lay still, eyes half closed, as if something final had been said, and he'd understood it better than anyone. Jake walked out of the courtroom alone, found Bruno still in place. We got her, he said quietly. Bruno blinked once, then closed his eyes. Not out of weariness, but maybe, just maybe, because the children weren't crying anymore. They tore down the barn in late spring. What was once Whitmore Farm, once a symbol of charity, then a tomb of secrets, was now flattened, cleared, and reborn. In its place, a quiet field bloomed with new life. Flowers, laughter, a winding path that led to an old oak tree at its center. They named it the Bruno Community Garden. No plaques for politicians, no speeches from mayors, just a small bronze sign by the gate that read, "In honor of those who waited to be heard," and the one who listened. Jake Reddick walked the path every Sunday morning before church. It had become a ritual, quiet and personal. He'd stop by the tree, brush a few fallen leaves off the headstone beneath it, and let the silence do what it needed to. Beneath that tree lay Bruno. He'd passed 2 winters after the trial, in his sleep, on the back porch of the sheriff's office, head resting on Jake's boot. They held a service. Lila Grace spoke. So did Agent Rivera. So did a boy named Eli, who'd once been too scared to speak at all. No one cried loudly. It wasn't that kind of goodbye. They buried Bruno with a silver whistle, a collar etched with "Deputy," and a folded drawing of him with wings, signed in bright crayon by a dozen children. The plaque by his grave said only, "Hero without a badge." Each year since, the children come back. Some are grown now, taller than Jake, wearing college hoodies and braces on their smiles. They bring flowers, letters, stuffed animals. A few bring dogs of their own. All of them stop at the grave. One girl leaves a tennis ball every time, a different color each year. Lila visits the most. She's older now, but she still kneels when she arrives, presses her palm to the cool stone, and sits for a long while. She talks quietly, sometimes reads, sometimes just listens. Jake doesn't ask what she says. He knows better. Bruno had always been the better listener anyway. In the final months, as his legs slowed and his muzzle grayed, Bruno still insisted on his morning patrol. Around the station, then down Main Street, stopping to nudge the hands of old men on benches and sniff the corners of mailboxes like they still held secrets. Jake tried, calling him off those last few weeks. But Bruno always rose, still alert, still listening. Not for commands, for pain, for trouble, for the sounds no one else bothered to notice. Cotton Ridge changed after Bruno. They built the new child welfare center next to the garden. Background checks were mandatory now, no longer a formality. Teachers attended trauma training. Parents started listening more closely when their children had nightmares. And Jake? He stayed, turned down a promotion. He didn't want a bigger badge. He wanted to be where listening still mattered. On the morning of the garden's dedication, a storm threatened but never came. Dozens of kids gathered beneath the tree, planting wildflowers around the stone. They each left something behind. A note, a sketch, a single paw print drawn in chalk. One boy whispered to Jake as they walked away. "He wasn't magic, was he?" Jake smiled. "No," he said. "He was better than that. He was real." And real is what saved them. In a world full of noise, where so many waited to be noticed, Bruno hadn't needed words. He didn't make speeches, he didn't carry a weapon, he just listened. And somehow that was enough to change everything. Now, if you followed this story, if it made you feel something, remember someone, or think a little longer about the silent ones in the room, we ask you to help us keep listening. Support our channel, German Shepherd, where we share true and inspired stories of loyalty, courage, and the animals who change human lives in quiet, extraordinary ways. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear capes or speak our language. Sometimes they just bark, and we listen.